you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, welcome everyone. This is Molly D'Agostino with the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program here at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. We're so thrilled to have you all join us today for the webinar called The Impacts of New Mobility Services on the Use of Other Travel Modes in California. This webinar is brought to you by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation in partnerships with the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program here at UC Davis. We are the National Center. I'll just give you a little background on the National Center. Is one of the 5 national centers designated by the U.S. Department of Transportation as part of their University Transportation Centers program. The center's mission is to advance a more sustainable transportation system through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. The center is led by the Institute of Transportation Studies here at University of California, Davis, in partnership with the University of California, Riverside, University of Southern California, California State University, Long Beach, University of Vermont, and Georgia Institute of Technology. We're also, in today's webinar, features new research from the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program here at UC Davis. And Giovanni will get into that more in his presentation. So now, without further ado, I will start a presentation from Giovanni Cicella, followed by comments and reflections from our special guest and respondent, Russ Brooks from Transportation for America. We have reserved plenty of time for questions from the audience. So if you'd like to submit a question for our speaker and or our guest respondent, then please type your question in the Q&A box, and we will flag your question for a response. You can also use this chat box to let us know if you're running into any technical issues, and we'll do our best to try to help. We'll address all questions at the end of the presentation and after our guest respondent has had an opportunity to ask some questions. So if you have a question regarding a specific slide, please note the slide number in your question. We will be recording today's webinar and posting it to our event page for later viewing. A link to the webinar recording, today's presentation slides, and associated reports will be sent to everyone in a follow-up email that will be going out tomorrow. I'll introduce our speaker and our guest respondent, and then we'll get started with the presentation. So first, Dr. Giovanni Cicella is the director of the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program and faculty member at the Institute of Transportation Studies here at the University of California, Davis. Dr. Cicella is also a senior research engineer in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Giovanni's research interests include travel behavior, travel demand modeling, travel survey methods, shared mobility, and automated vehicles. Giovanni is the chair of the TRB Committee on ICT and Transportation, and he is the communication coordinator of the Transportation and Sustainability Committee, also at TRB. Given his interest and skills in automated vehicle research, he also serves in several NCHRP panels on the impacts of connected and automated vehicles. We're also joined by Russ Brooks of Transportation for America. Russ Brooks is director of the Smart Cities at Transportation for America. Russ Brooks joined T4A in 2012 and initially served as T4A's deputy director for 2 years. Prior to joining T4A, Russ served as the national director for CABT and responsible for strategizing, planning, and implementing their state and national policy agenda, as well as managing the organization's field staff. He has worked on numerous local and national political and advocacy campaigns, ranging from children's health to education referendums to congressional and Senate races. So now, thank you so much to you both for joining us, and we will get started with Giovanni's presentation. So Giovanni, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Molly, for the nice introduction. Okay, thank you very much, Molly, for the nice introduction, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm very glad to be here, the speaker for this seminar today. And today we will talk about some of the research we've been developing with our research team at UC Davis on the impact of new mobility services, focusing in particular on the adoption of ride-hailing services like Uber and Lyft and other forms of shared mobility, and understanding what is the relationship with the use of other modes of transportation in California. So without waiting more, I will just jump into some of the research questions that we have for our research. So what we focus in our research is what moves our research is understanding better what motivates the adoption of new services like, for instance, the use of Uber and Lyft and other forms of shared mobility. And the interest is understanding what are the circumstances that lead to some individuals in using these services, but also how frequently California uses ride-hailing services and how different groups of variables like social demographics, built environment, lifestyles, and personal preferences affect the use of these services. And also part of our research is also dedicated to understanding what limits and encourages the use of these services and what are the relationship between the use of these services and other modes of transportation. So part in our research, we want to understand what motivates us is understanding how shared mobility is changing the way we relate with travel behavior, vehicle ownership, and other lifestyle decisions. And to do so, we have developed a number of different data collections at UC Davis to understand how different groups of variables, including personal preferences and attitudes, lifestyles, adoption of technology, relate to the adoption of new shared mobility services and other components of travel behavior. In particular, part of this research is motivated also to understand how in the midterm, medium-term decisions like car ownership are affected by the adoption of new services. Of course, Uber and Lyft are the ones that are most commonly adopted by users, but we also investigate the impacts of car-sharing services, bike-sharing services, all new mobility services which are provided nowadays thanks to the use of smartphone technologies and other forms of information communication technology. More in the short term, the question is also to understand how components of travel behavior, like the use of different modes, are affected by the adoption of new services. So if somebody is using Uber and Lyft for a specific trip, for instance, does that mean that they are leaving their car at home because they find it more convenient, for instance, to travel to downtown and they can avoid searching for parking or having extra costs for parking? Or is this taking passengers out of public transportation and leading to a reduction in ridership for public transportation services or walking and bicycling or other components of travel behavior? And certainly we expect this to be a composite effect in which to some extent some users will do one type of substitution, some others will do some other behavior, and also there will be certainly some induced demand. And so our research helps understanding under what circumstances which individuals do what. So many of you might be familiar with some recent research that have been published by UC Davis. Our colleagues Regina Clilo and Gori Mishra already investigated some of the topics I'm going to talk today in this report that was published in fall 2017. This was a study that focused mainly on 7 big cities in the U.S., Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. Today we will talk actually about a little bit of a different angle of our research in terms that we will analyze a data set that is specific to California and that doesn't focus only on big cities and metro areas like this previous study from our colleagues did, but focuses on the entire state of California, including also rural, suburban region, and the growing areas, for instance, in the Central Valley of California. So this is what we are working on. We've been working on in the last couple of years, and it's a panel study of emerging transportation trends in California. We started working on this project in 2015, and this is a project that has started thanks to the support of the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, Caltrans, the STEPS program at UC Davis, and several other partners that have been supporting our research. And this is a statewide study of emerging transportation trends in California that we started with the first round of data collection in fall 2015, in which we focus in particular on 2 demographic groups. We focus on millennials, those that were between 18 and 34 in 2015, and the members of the so-called Generation X, so middle-aged adults that were 35 to 50 in 2015. And for this study, we designed a quota sampling approach in which we collected respondents from all different geographic regions of California. We divided California for this effort in 6 major regions, and all neighborhood types. So we had respondents from predominantly urban, predominantly suburban, and rural areas. And I want to stress again that this is part of a longitudinal study. So we have a rotating panel approach in which we will have future rounds of data collection, in which we will survey again the same respondents from the first round of data collection, but also we will expand the data set, collecting additional respondents from all the entire adult population 18 plus in California, and we have another round of data collection coming up very soon in spring 2018. I want to acknowledge all the great group of colleagues that have been working on this project, including faculty members here at UC Davis and Georgia Tech, Susan Handy, Pat McFarlane, and Lou Fulton, and a great group of graduate students that have been supporting this research. This research will not be possible without their support. So in the first wave of data collection that we studied a couple of years ago, we had a very detailed survey that was administered to 2,400 respondents in California. And we collected information on several different groups of variables, including individual attitudes and preferences, use of technology, residential location and living arrangements, and what led to the current residential location, employment details, transportation mode perception, current travel behavior, and very detailed information on shared mobility services. We use in several questions to collect information about the use of car sharing, Uber, Lyft, several other different modes of transportation. And then we collected a number of additional information to understand also the life changes that are happening in the life of the individuals, including what happened in the last 3 years in the life of the individual, and what they are planning to do in the next 3 years in terms of plans to purchase a vehicle, interest in adopting alternative fuel vehicles, plans to relocate to another city, changes on job, and so on. Some of the focus of this research is in particular in understanding how emerging technologies are revolutionizing transportation. We don't focus only on the shared mobility services, but more in general, we explore how the use of smartphones for communication devices and all the use of new apps, for instance, to check information about where a bus or other modes of transportation will be arriving, or having opportunities to multitask during the trip, or several other components of ICT, like, for instance, adoption of e-shopping or telecommuting, are changing lifestyles. And then, of course, a big component of this study is in understanding how new services like shared mobility, and in particular ride-hailing, are changing the life of users. For instance, having the opportunity to lower the levels of car ownership, or even extending the range of public transportation, providing a mode to access a transportation mode. So in the first data collection that we had, we controlled for a number of different shared mobility services, including car sharing, bike sharing, dynamic ride sharing services, and ride-hailing services. In the new data collection that we will have in spring 2018, an important component of the data collection will also focus on pooled services like Uber Pool and Lyft Line. Unfortunately, 2 years ago when we started this project, these services were not very common yet. They were only in beta testing in the San Francisco Bay Area. So for this reason, we didn't really collect a lot of information on the pool services. But for the new round of data collection, there will be an important component of the data collection. So the next slide shows a little bit an overview of the data set. We have, as I mentioned before, a focus which is on the entire state of California. We collected 2,400 cases, including both millennials and members of the Generation X, for all different regions of California. We focus on the 6 major regions of California, the 4 big MPO areas of San Francisco, Sacramento, Los Angeles, and San Diego, the big area of the Central Valley of California, which is a rapidly growing region with a lot of new residential growth in this area happening, and then the remaining rest of California, which is mainly the northern part of the state, the mountain, and the coastal region. And all cases in the data set were geocoded based on the residential location information that was provided by the respondents. This allowed us to integrate data that we already have in the data set with additional sources of data, including information from the U.S. Census, information from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Smart Location data, information from the All Transit data set that has been developed by the Center for Neighborhood Technology, and also information on the Walk Score, Bike Score, and Transit Score provided by the commercial website walkscore.com. We also use information developed in previous research that was led mainly by our colleague Deborah Salon, previously UC Davis, now a assistant professor in the Arizona State University, that helped classify all census tracts in the United States as predominantly urban, suburban, and rural based on the land use features that are in the local area. For those familiar with this research, you probably have already seen some of the papers that were produced from this research. We analyzed several different topics, and each one of the boxes in this slide actually refers to a specific analysis and a specific paper or report that is available on our website, where you can check some of the information related to the amount of VMT in the different socio-demographic groups, the adoption of public transportation, and several other different components of travel behavior. In the rest of the presentation, we will focus mainly on the adoption of shared mobility, looking in particular at the impact that ride-hailing services, which are the services that have been introduced rather recently in this country, but they are growing pretty fast, the changes that they are promoting, actually, they are generating in travel behavior. And for all of you that are interested in accessing some of the previous findings from our work, we have a set of reports that are available on our website, and you can check them there. And we also have a new report that focuses in particular on the adoption of shared mobility that will be available very soon. So diving into the adoption of ride-hailing services, which has been a big important component of this research, we developed a number of analyses investigating, for instance, what type of services are used in the different components of California and the characteristics of the users of these services. Not surprising, the adoption of services like Uber and Lyft has been higher among the residents of the urban areas, in particular in the San Francisco and Los Angeles areas, lower in the rest of California. When we look into the distribution of residents in the different type of neighborhoods, again, not surprisingly, the proportion of users of these services increases a lot when we move from rural to suburban to urban area. And this is consistent in all the different areas of California. Looking at the social demographics, we also find pretty consistently some trends in which these services are particularly common among the individuals that tend to be younger. In particular, we have a peak among older millennials, the urban population, the rather well-educated population, not necessarily high income, but in particular among the better educated population, and among the people that even work and study or only work. We have also, higher use among the users that do not have, the residents that do not have a presence of children in the household. However, instead of just focusing on descriptive statistics, in our research we developed a set of models to understand what are the relationships that lead to the use of these services. And some of the results are available in our report, and I will summarize them in some of the next slides. So, for instance, in developing a model of the adoption of the ride-hailing services like Lyft and Uber, we could identify the relationship that ride-hailing has, the adoption of ride-hailing has with some social demographics like age and income education, were in particularly important in explaining the use of these services, but also about the impact of built environment variables like car accessibility and land use mix that both positively affect the use of ride-hailing. We also found a big relationship between the familiarity with the use of information communication technology and the use of other emerging transportation services like car sharing, for instance, where all associated with a higher adoption of these services. In order to investigate also among the differences between specific groups of users, we use a latent class modeling approach to differentiate the different adoption rates and the different patterns of use among different groups of users. And we could identify some pretty nicely defined latent classes of users. In particular, the first group on the left is the one that uses the services. They are more likely to use these services. And this is more likely to include independent millennials, those that already established their own household, that they don't live anymore in their family of origin. They live in urban areas. They tend to be not married. They do not have kids, and they tend to live in more dense urban areas. The second group has also pretty decent adoption rate. This includes more affluent users, and we see that the adoption rate of these users increases when these users in particular make long-distance trips and they use this mode of transportation, for instance, to access airports. And then the final group is the group that have the lowest adoption rate. It includes largely residents of rural areas where these services are not very common, and also least affluent users. So the adoption patterns are pretty different among these groups, and we notice that also the relationship with other variables changes quite a bit. The adoption rate in the first group is actually the highest. The second group, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, is also the group that is more affected by the eventual presence of business long-distance trips, in which if they do this type of trips, they actually increase the likelihood of using these services as an access mode to travel to the airports, for instance. When we look into the frequency use of these services, not surprising, the use of these services is more common among the younger members of the population, and also is more frequent among members of the urban population. So people that tend to live in the urban areas in all different geographic regions of California, they tend to use these services more often. And looking into the relationship with other variables, we estimate in multivariate models also for explaining the frequency or use of these services, and we found that several different variables have a strong relationship with the use of these services. In particular, we found that the likelihood of using the service frequently is particularly correlated and related to the some of the land use features in the built environment, in particular those that live in central core of the cities, and the likelihood of living in a household that does not own vehicles or they have a lower number of vehicles per household. Again, this not necessarily means causality, but we found that the users that live in households that have a lower number of vehicles, they tend to use these services more often. Very interesting is also the competition with other shared mobility services. We found, in fact, that users that use car-sharing services, for instance, are more likely to use Uber and Lyft too. However, when we investigate the frequency of using the services, we found an inverse relationship. And so the higher the frequency of car-sharing use, the lower the frequency of Uber and Lyft. So it seems like that the same users that tend to be more inclined to adopt shared mobility services, they tend to use all different services, but an increasing frequency on one service corresponds usually to a lifestyle that leads more to that type of service and a reduction in the use of other services. Some of the research that we do also focus in particular on the impacts on other travel modes. And so we focus on what the adoption of these services is causing on other components of travel behavior. And to do this, we did it with several different components of information that we have in our data set. One of these was to collect directly from the respondents the self-reported impact that the latest Uber and Lyft trip had on the use of other modes. And we found that users have different impacts of their use of these services on other modes. Somewhat concerning, we found that several young members of the millennial generation actually reported that they reduced the amount of walking and biking they did because of the use of Uber and Lyft. So this is somewhat concerning for those of us that care about promoting a healthy lifestyle and a use of active modes of transportation. In order to dive more into the different impacts that the use of these services have on different components of travel behavior, we developed a latent class analysis that investigated the different components of the impacts in different groups of users. And in this latent class analysis, we could identify different classes of behavioral changes associated with adoption of new services. The first group on the left is actually the largest group in our data set, and we found that about 53% of the members in our data set that they used these services, they tend to fit into this category. These are users that are predominantly living in urban areas. They tend to live in neighborhoods that are more walkable with good transit access. They tend to be more cost and time sensitive, and they are very often not very affluent, and it includes the younger members of the millennial generation. And these users tend to be the most frequent users of Uber and Lyft. The second group is a pretty well-defined group also that includes rather affluent suburban dwellers. They live in car-oriented neighborhoods with poor transit access. They include very often travelers. They travel more for business. They have more affluent. They tend to be more monomodal and use their car with a high VMT during the year. And they are medium frequency users of Uber and Lyft. And the third group is actually the smallest one in our data set. Only 10% of the users of these services in our data set include suburban dwellers that tend to live also in neighborhoods which are not very accessible by transit and walking. They are rather affluent. They are not very cost and time sensitive, and they tend to be, despite living into low accessibility areas, they tend to be more multimodal when possible. They like to bike and they like to use public transportation when possible. And I would say, unfortunately, this group of users is only 10% in our data, but we would like to see this group growing. And the reason is that this group actually includes the members that are using these services, causing an increase in the use of transit. So from the point of view of the societal benefits, this is probably the type of group of users that we would like to see growing in terms of the size of this class. When we look at the other classes, the large class on the left has a mixed impact in which we see the adoption of Uber and Lyft having a mixed impact on reducing for some users the use of their own car, for some other users the use of public transit, for some other users the reduction in the use of walking and bicycling. The second class in the middle is also pretty interesting. We see a very, very clear-cut effect here. It's actually rare to see in a latent class analysis such a clear, defined impact. Pretty much all the users of this class, which are suburban dwellers living in traditional households and they travel more often by plane, they use this mode pretty much to access big transportation terminals and mainly airports and substitute the use of their car with the use of these new services. So somehow pretty defined and pretty different impacts of these users in the three classes. In the next steps of the research, we're also investigating how the use of new shared mobility services is impacting car ownership. And we will do this in particular through the adoption of analysis that use the longitudinal data in our data set. In particular, in 2018, we will have our new round of data collection in spring that will allow us to show how users or adopters of the services, for instance, decide to modify their car ownership eventually over time, eventually postponing the purchase of a new vehicle or adapting the new mobility services and adjusting their car ownership, eventually giving up their car, and so on. And so this is a component of the data collection that we will analyze in the next few months. I want to wrap up just in the next couple of slides because I know we don't have a lot of time, but I want to mention that we have many other analyses in our data set. And so for all of you that are interested, I invite you to contact us, and we will provide the references to our papers and reports where we disclose some of the other results of our work. I want to summarize with some policy implications for our work. We find in our work that several factors affect the use of new shared mobility services. In particular, we have that cost and the preference to use personal vehicles is reported as an important factor affecting the use of ride-hailing. This was actually a component analysis that I didn't focus a lot during this presentation today, but we have a paper that was presented last week at the Transportation Research Board in Washington, D.C. on this topic. And we also believe that this will change a lot once pooling services are available nowadays. And so pooling is actually being a big strategy that is being promoted by the new ride-hailing service company to reduce price and also, from the societal benefits, they bring the ability to reduce some of the negative externalities of, for instance, having too many vehicles on the road. And so this can be pooling one of the opportunities to align the public interest with the business interest of the companies providing these services. Still, we need a lot more effort in understanding what factors affect the decision of riders to pool services and what incentives and policies eventually could encourage the users to do so. And this is something that we plan to do in the next steps of the research. But also, our research so far has shown that single passenger ride-hailing services tend to have some mixed effects on users. For some users, they substitute for driving. So some other users, or actually for some users under certain circumstances, they replace the use of transit and active mode, especially among some group of users and under certain circumstances. But they can promote the attractiveness of living without a car. For instance, in particular in urban dwellers, they can find more flexibility and access to transportation modes thanks to the availability of shared mobility services. So in the future, we believe there are a lot of opportunities for demand-responsive services, and this will be in particular important for public transit services. We understand that public transit agencies today, they feel threatened sometimes by the adoption of new shared mobility services, but there's also an opportunity to integrate these services with public transit to provide better overall service that could provide actually more economic and environmental benefits to the users and to the agencies. And certainly we need to do a lot more research to understand how the causal links work between the use of these services and the use of other modes. In the next steps of our research, we plan to analyze several of the data that we have from this data set and from some of the other data that we are collecting. In particular, we plan to have more nuanced and analytical approaches to investigate some of the behavioral changes and understand in particular how different trip purposes might affect behavioral users at different times of the day under different circumstances. Also, as I mentioned, the longitudinal data will allow us to understand how the relationship between the adoption of these new mobility services relates to medium-term decisions, like, for example, vehicle ownership decision. And we'll focus in particular on new pool services, on Uber Pool and Lyft Line. And we believe that a lot of more research is needed in this area, in particular because the future that will be dominated by the driverless vehicles will bring many more changes. And so if you want to inform policy and we want to support planning processes, we need to get much better information on these topics. I also want to mention for all of you that were wondering why we are focusing particularly on ride-hailing services, I want to mention that we have quite a bit of information also on the use of other modes of shared mobility, including car-sharing services, bike-sharing services. We have quite a bit of publications that have been already released or they are coming up in the future months, and I invite you to check all of those. Of course, the time today was limited, and so we had to focus on some topics, but I will invite you to check all the different presentations and papers that we have already available, and I believe these slides will be available to all of you after this webinar, so you can check some of the references to our papers. We have a set of papers in particular that relate to the use of these services and the relationship with other components of travel behavior. All of them will be available on our website. And I want to acknowledge also, the great support I received from my graduate student, Farzad Alemi, who has actually been developing his PhD dissertation on this topic. And so these 4 papers actually will be part also of his PhD dissertation coming up in a few months during 2018. And we have a big report that is actually right now being reviewed by the funding agency and will be available, we expect, by the end of January. So if you check our website, it will be possible to check this report that focuses on the adoption of all the different types of shared mobility services in California and their relationship with the other components of travel behavior. I will wrap up here. I know we don't have a lot of time today, but I will be very happy to answer any question. And thank you again for the opportunity to present this webinar and the attention today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Giovanni. And at this time, we're going to turn it over to Russ Brooks. So, Russ, if you have any questions or comments on the presentation, we'd love to hear them. And you should be unmuted. You may have to unmute yourself on your end as well.
Okay, I got it there.
All right, great.
Thanks, Molly. And thanks for having me today. And thanks, Giovanni. This is really interesting research. I think the things that kind of stuck out to me a little bit were, one, that it's obviously concerning to hear that these services seem to be having mixed results, that they're both trending users away from transit and active transportation, or at least some groups, but also that they're shedding their cars. But if you're shedding your car and jumping into a kind of a ride hail alone, there may be limited overall benefits. And it seems to me that what I heard out of a lot of it, and I'm interested to see more research, is that the private sector companies, the ride-hailing, the car-sharing, and others have really tapped into a pain point for residents in urban cities, that transit agencies are really struggling to kind of keep pace with this private sector, and that the research is really indicative of that challenge, that Amazon, Uber, and others have set a really high bar and expectation for the level of service that people are willing to deal with on a daily basis, that unfortunately it kind of continually lowers the threshold that people are willing to wait for transit, are willing to take the extra time that transit often takes, and that they're constantly valuing or constantly weighing the value prop against their time. I know I experienced that in my life, and I know that there are times when I say, oh, well, I don't really feel like waiting for the bus today, or traffic's really heavy, so I'm not going to take the long route. And so I think transit agencies really need to, transportation and transit agencies really need to, figure out this kind of entrepreneurial cultural shift and really start to adopt the best parts of the private sector. I think Giovanni mentioned that this pooling, on-demand, demand responsive, that there's certainly an opening for that in cities. And the last thing I think I'll say is just that really this research shows why it's really important to get this information and this data so that cities and planners can better understand the impacts, both positive and negative, that new mobility options are having in their cities, get a better understanding of who's using them, and whether or not they're actually increasing access, that they're increasing equity in our local communities, access to jobs and healthcare and education, and are they doing so in a way that reduces congestion and single occupancy travel and resulting in lower emissions and overall DMT. I think these are the challenges that cities really need to figure out. I think it's really important that they understand this population that they're clearly not serving well, both on the higher educated, higher income side of the scale, as well as the lower income and lower educated side of the scale. So I think it's really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to kind of seeing the next report that you just mentioned.
Great. Thank you so much, Russ. Some interesting questions have also been posted on our Q&A chat. The first question is probably a simple one, but the question is from Stefan Axer, and the question is around whether the survey data will be available for public research. Is this data openly available?
So thanks a lot, Russ, for your comments, and thanks for the user line for Stefan for the question. Russ, I agree with you all the challenges that you were highlighting, and I agree, the public transportation agencies are struggling to catch up with the changes, but it's actually important for them to focus on these changes. And we need to do a lot of research, and it's so important to collect this data for cities and to support planning efforts. Answering the question from Stefan, this data had been collected. We have an agreement with the agency that we're going to use them for the purposes of this research. We are open to collaboration with other researchers, and so for data request, we have suggested that the researchers contact our research team, and we discuss the purpose of the use of the data while respecting the privacy of the users for which they're being collected, and so we can align the interest of the collection of the data with the purposes for which they're used while protecting the privacy of the 2,400 people that actually disclose all their private information, all the information about where they live, what they do, and so on. And so I would welcome, follow-up conversation on that, and some agreements are possible to access some of the information in our data set. Absolutely.
And this is a question around data security and data privacy is an important question around that comes to bear during the Three Revolutions conversation. So I know Russ and Tifere have taken done some interesting work around data availability and data privacy. I don't know if you'd like to speak to that as well.
Sure. I think one of the challenges that the cities have had is negotiating with the private sector to get data, and I think one of the two arguments that the private sector, at least that we've heard, uses most often is proprietary business information and customer privacy. And I think they're both valid concerns, and I think that it's really important for cities to figure out both what data that they're interested or which data that they're particularly interested in and why. A lot of times cities just make blanket requests for everything under the sun. So I think they need to be really clear about which data they want and what they want to do with it. But also they need to figure out new systems for anonymizing and aggregating that data in a way that not only protects the proprietary business information of the individual companies, but also the individual users. I know that there's a number of different organizations that are working on this. There's a Trusted Data Collaborative that is a partnership between the University of Washington and the City of Seattle that's been doing some really interesting work. And then secondly, I know that Kevin Webb out of the Open Transport Partnership has started something called Shared Streets, and part of that operation is a data repository, an anonymized data repository that cities and private sector companies can use to aggregate their data.
Right. Great. Yes, exactly. Lots of really important topics here. So to switch gears a little bit, a question from Todd Edelman is around, do you have data on the land use amongst e-bike owners? This is a rather specific question related to slide number 29 and 31. Giovanni, feel free to answer this question, or if you'd like to follow up directly with Todd after the the session, that would also work. So
yeah, very quick answer. We don't have very good data about the owners of e-bikes. We ask whether users use an e-bike as a means of transportation, but we have a very, very limited number of people that report that use in our travel behavior questions in our data set, and so we could not really do any meaningful analysis, honestly, with that small number of respondents. We actually have not checked information about ownership of e-bike. It's a very good point, and we will actually consider that for inclusion in the next rounds of data collection. So actually, thank you for the feedback on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, moving quickly on. A question is also around whether the question is, do you use this data within simulation tools in order to simulate the mobility in large-scale areas and to understand the impact of traffic? If yes, what software are you using? So, yeah.
This is an excellent question and absolutely identifies a big, important research question that we are addressing in future projects here at UC Davis. Currently, we have not used the data from this data set to inform simulation and modeling tools, but we see the need for that. In particular, travel demand forecasting models, they usually have been calibrated using data from several years ago. The most recent National Household Travel Survey is from 2009, where these surveys were not available, and the frequency with which these large-scale regional household travel surveys or national household travel surveys is such that not very current information is collected on new transportation modes. And so we've been discussing actually the need for updating travel demand forecasting tools with, for instance, MPO leaders and planners and modelers, as they need a tool to include information about new transportation modes into their models. As part of the research that we've been discussing with, in particular, the MPO for Sacramento, we've been discussing how we can inform their modeling tools using data from this project and other projects we're carrying out here at UC Davis. But also we have a current project that we're starting soon with the California Resources Board, in which we will use statewide travel demand models to predict ranges of potential future impacts of shared mobility, but also autonomous vehicles. And we plan to do so, trying to get the best knowledge from this project, other projects developed by other research teams around the country to inform models that have been already estimated and they are already used by agencies to predict future forecasts of travel demand with under assumptions of new mobility services which are available already and they will be increasingly available in the future, but they're not currently represented in those models. And so the link between research and practice and planning is actually something that we plan to focus particularly in the future steps, in particular as part of the activities of the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program at UC Davis.
Great. Yeah. So also changing gears slightly, we have a question from Jay Young Jung on have you looked at the rideshare trip by trip purpose? And the examples given were work, shopping, school, recreational, others. And I'll also back it up and say it's important probably that Giovanni define what we mean by ride sharing, and then discuss the context of how trip purpose will affect the use of Lyft, Uber, and genuine shared rides.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good question. We have information about trip purpose in our data set when we look at the use of different modes of transportation for either commuting trips or for non-commuting trips. Unfortunately, one of the problems that we have in this data set is some level of aggregation in which we don't have all different trip purposes separated, but we have mainly classified them as either work-related and commuting trips and non-commuting purposes. And in particular, this is something that we want to better address in the new round of data collection that will happen in spring. And we want to collect for the use of shared mobility services the time of day and the information about the trip purpose for which these services were used, which we believe is going to be very important in understanding the willingness to pay of users and the different likelihood of sharing a ride with others. And this is something that definitely we plan to do for both the ride-hailing services, like the single-person ride-hailing services, like what we know as Uber and Lyft, providing as the big, large companies in the U.S. market. The pool ride-hailing services, like Uber Pool or Lyft Line, the most common service. services in this country, but also for the other services provided by other companies and other possibilities, either for shared mobility and traditional transportation modes.
Great. So moving on, we're going to take the next two questions together because they're quite related. The first question is asked by Canuck. The question is, how can transportation agencies work with Uber and Lyft to incentivize ride pooling? This is a core question at the core of our research. And then the following question, are users or individuals ride hailing aware of the effects of these services on collective public transportation? I imagine that this implies the effects on traffic and emissions. So I think that those questions are related. So I'll ask that you respond to those questions.
Sorry, the first question was?
The first question is, how can we incentivize ride pooling?
Sure.
And the question is how do we make individuals aware of the impact of the ride hailing on the community?
Absolutely. So incentives have been tested in several different agencies. Now, whether these incentives are working out or not, it's up actually for the evaluation, and some of the work we're doing actually here in our institution is actually to support transit agencies and planning agencies to better align TDM strategies, incentives, and better coordinate the provision of these services. Most of the incentives usually are provided to use TNCs, the transportation network companies, or what we call ride-hailing, as an access mode to public transportation. Now, many times this happens still with a single occupant ride-hailing service. We understand that for societal benefit, we would like to provide more emphasis on the pool services. However, one thing to consider is that usually there is a land use issue, is that in most locations, like pool services are convenient, mainly in dense urban areas where the origin and destination are actually located close to each other, and so it's easier actually to pool riders on the same itinerary. On the other hand, the integration between transit agencies and the transit services and ride-hailing services not very often happens in those areas. Those areas are actually areas where the transit agencies actually want to promote their own services, where they have better quality of service on main corridors, and they provide actually the integration with TNCs as a feeding service on low-density areas where many times the access by walking and bicycling might be low. So there's a little bit of a struggle between the two parts, because on one way we would like to promote pooling services. On the other hand, many times the integration between transit and TNCs is something that happens in areas where pooling is not very convenient, simply because there are not a lot of origin destinations that could align. Of course, big transportation attractors, a big subway station, a big railway station, could be the exception, because they could have a generator during some times of the day in which actually pooling will become much easier. But the problem becomes very often about the land use. Moving forward, some planning agencies are certainly needs to reconsider their plans, and actually shared mobility services are becoming part of the scenario of transportation. And so even when we plan, for instance, the TODs, transit-oriented developments, we can consider actually how transit is changing, because it's not just transit anymore as it was conceived in the past, but it's becoming increasingly some flexible way of providing transit, in which we could have rail, bus services, we could have microtransit, we could have integration with shared mobility services, which could be operated in many different ways. LA is a great example actually, where they are testing actually different solutions, so either providing the service by themselves or partnering with the agencies, and this is something that's been tested in several different agencies, and something that actually is up there for evaluation of the most efficient way to do it. One thing I want to make sure is to explain that our position in the agency, we are a research institution, so we want to provide better knowledge. We don't really have interest in supporting a specific service versus another one. So our role is to provide better informed decisions, knowledge-based decisions, and supporting the societal benefits, aligning the interests of the transportation services which are provided to match the interests of the users.
And Russ, I'd like to turn this question over to you slightly. How do you think that we can incentivize pool travel, and is this something that your organization has focused on at all?
Sure. I think that's a really important question, because I think Giovanni's right in the sense that there is a correlation And cities need to figure this out. A lot of the cities that we're working with in our Smart Cities Collaborative are doing just this. And I think that they're trying to figure out both the carrots and the sticks that they have at their disposal to drive the behaviors and the outcomes they want to see. On the carrot side, they're thinking about how to provide the infrastructure that TNCs and ride-hailing companies are looking for, whether that's shared lanes or priority signaling or loading zones for pooled rides, potentially creating space at transit stops, mobility hubs, and others. They're also thinking about what are the enforcement sticks that they have? How do they, support in one way the positive behavior that they want to see, but also stop seeing people pull over in the side of the road or giving preferential treatment to pooled rides in different ways. Lastly, I would say that some cities are thinking about congestion pricing. New York is certainly thinking about that. We signed on a letter with a number of other organizations earlier this week that was specifically geared at creating policies that incentivize pooled travel regardless of the source. So if it's you and your family having the car filled up, or if it's a TNC and a pooled ride, that they should be treated the same, that a single occupancy vehicle, whether it's a privately hailed ride or it's your own car, should be treated differently as well. So there are a number of strategies that cities are exploring to really drive this behavior.
Great, thank you. Yes, and we know that New York is considering this right now, and many other states are in the earlier stages, exploratory stages of how we can identify opportunities to make travel more efficient and fill those empty seats. So great question, and this does come online with a question that Drew Cooper posed about incentivizing rideshare and not pulling from transit. So I think let's bring the conversation back to a question around how do we address the impact of TNCs on transit. This question was posed by Drew Cooper.
Drew raises a very good point. Actually, there is a potential that promoting pooling with ride-hailing services might actually damage public transportation. And I want to mention actually that apart from the role of incentives, this is something that can already happen if we leave just the market self-regulate. The price point of pooling services many times is becoming so low that it makes it convenient in terms not only of travel time but also in terms of cost to use a pool service compared to public transportation. And that is clear, a clear challenge that we have. Now the solution, however, is not making a war against the ride-hailing services. Neither this would be acceptable from a societal point of view. We live in a free market. We would not imagine making a war against companies. On the other hand, these companies certainly provide benefit to the users. So also from the point of view of the public benefits, there is benefit that are being brought to the market from the companies. So the other solution also could be, of course, do nothing. We could just let the market do whatever happens, but also that might bring many externalities. And so we believe actually that the role of policies here might be very important. Now, whether it's incentive for pooling or actually might be, Russ was actually mentioning, the carrot and the stick that always need to be used somehow in planning processes. It probably need to be a combination of incentives, for instance, to have trips that terminate in the big transportation hubs, and this can bring actually benefits for the transit agencies. Transit agencies lose a lot of money providing services in some areas with low ridership. And so if they can provide those services instead of bus services with small vehicles and microtransit service and so on in a more efficient way, they could bring actually to better service at a lower cost. On the other hand, probably we should increase restrictions and some regulations about, for instance, service that could increase congestion in central core of the city, increase emission, and damage other forms of transportation. We don't want too many riders to take ride-hailing services just because it's too convenient and it will take empty buses, or it will actually make people stop bicycling to work or not walking anymore. And so this is it's not an easy trade-off, and it's also not an easy solution that can be applied everywhere. So probably each context requires specific interventions that go in both ways, providing incentives for some type of services that we want to promote, but also some types of restrictions, making things more complicated, whether through pricing or through restrictions to the circulation of the vehicle for some other services that actually should be regulated in some way.
Great. And there's a couple of related questions here talking about how Mirko asks, will your data allow us to understand how TNC services are used as feeder modes for public transit? So this is a very related question to the one you just answered, but if there's anything else you want to add relating to, the use of ride-hailing on serving as a feeder to traditional public transit.
Thank you for this question. It's a very important point. We have some information in this current data set, but I would really recommend looking at the results we will get from the new data that we're collecting now in spring 2018, because the emphasis on understanding the specific role that TNCs have as a feeder is going to be much higher in the new round of data collection. And this will be in particular because we will collect information about the time of the day, specific when the trip was made, the trip purpose, and also if the trip was done by themselves or with others and so on. And that affects a lot the tipping point, for example, for pricing. If it is just one passenger, it's very different if 3 passengers are accessing a public transportation station, for instance, and also the trip purpose and the time of day affects a lot this relationship. And so this is something on which we had some more limitation in the previous round of data collection. Also based on that, we are now actually addressing this issue in the new round of data collection in spring.
Yes, exactly. Great. So we just have time for a couple more questions. I think we'll turn to a question around traffic congestion. So I think this was addressed slightly, but the question was posed: Have you done any studies around the potential for traffic congestion caused by ride-hailing? And I know there have been studies done, but Giovanni would like to answer that question.
There's a big topic that is on the mind of everybody. We've been discussing potential studies on this topic in partnership with the ride-hailing companies. To do that, we will need access to data in particular to studying the exact origin, destination of each trip, and the time of day, and so on. So it's not something we've already addressed in our center, but it's something that we are exploring as potential future steps in the research.
So actually, I think we're going to close there, and we're going to invite you all to participate in our upcoming 3 Revolutions conference, where we can continue much of this conversation. That conference is on February 26th and 27th here at UC Davis, and we'd love to have you there. You can find information at the link posted in the slide here, 3rev.ucdavis.edu/conference. So really looking forward to having you there. And please look out for a follow-up email in your inboxes with links to today's presentation and links to download the associated reports. Also, please take a couple minutes to share your thoughts with us today about today's webinar by filling out a very short evaluation survey. Of course, us researchers, we love surveys, so please help us make these webinars better. And mark your calendar for our next NCST webinar. The title is Considering Traffic-Related Air Pollution in Bicycle Route Planning, and it's on February 7th, 2018, from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. same time. So this webinar will highlight new research from Canuck with the Center for the Environmental Research and Technology and the University of California, Riverside. This research will discuss exploring how the inclusion of traffic-related air pollution can change the outcome of bicycle route planning, using an example from the city of Riverside. We're looking forward to that presentation, and want to thank you all for joining us, and thanks so much to both Giovanni and Russ for bringing their insights to this conversation. So thank you so much, and with that, we'll close the webinar.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you.